Hi, this is Jeremy James, plant physiologist at the Eastern Oregon Ag Research Center, and I'm here to present an Ag Minute. This week we will talk about elements that are toxic to plants. In arid systems such as Harney County, two big elements we get concerned about are boron and sodium. One source of these elements can be the soil on which these plants grow. Another important source, though, is the irrigation water applied to these plants. In arid systems, water often has a high mineral content to start with, and because of the high evaporation rate in these systems, toxic elements tend to accumulate in areas that are irrigated. If your irrigation water is relatively pure, it is possible to apply a lot of water and periodically leach these elements below the root zone. However, if your irrigation water has a high concentration of any element toxic to plants, it makes it impossible to reduce toxic elements in soil by leaching. The rest of this week we will be talking about characteristics of alkaline and saline soils, and why two elements, boron and sodium, are particularly toxic to plants. This week we are talking about elements that are toxic to plants, giving special consideration to the saline and alkaline soil conditions we can experience in Harney County. Alkaline soils are not necessarily saline soils. Alkaline soils are simply soils with a pH greater than 7, and they are very common in arid and semi-arid systems. Saline soils also are common in arid systems and are usually identified by their electrical conductivity. We call this value EC. Essentially, the more salt there is in the soil, the faster the soil conducts electricity. So if we measure the electrical conductivity and it's greater than 4, then we usually classify these as saline soils. In alkaline soils, boron toxicity usually is a greater problem than sodium toxicity. In saline soils, both boron and sodium can be a problem. We will spend the next 2 days talking about why boron and sodium is toxic, and then conclude with some possible strategies to manage both essential and toxic soil elements. This week we are talking about elements that are toxic to plants, giving special consideration to boron and sodium. In alkaline soils with high pH, boron absorbs very tightly to clay minerals, making it very hard to leach boron from the soils. If there is significant boron in your irrigation water, boron will tend to accumulate over time, suppressing plant yields. Typical signs of boron toxicity are chlorosis on leaf tips and the sides of leaves. High levels of boron can be initially stored in the cell walls or neutralized with sugar compounds in the cell. Once these mechanisms of boron tolerance are overwhelmed, high levels of boron enter the plant cells where they interfere with a number of metabolic processes. It is well known that crops differ widely in their ability to grow on soils with high boron levels. This difference among crops appears not to be due to crops differing in ability to tolerate boron, but is more related to crops differing in ability to exclude boron uptake into roots. This is to say that the more boron-tolerant plants appear to be better at excluding boron through uptake by the root system. This week we are talking about elements that are toxic to plants. Yesterday we talked about boron. Today we'll be talking about sodium. Saline soils high in sodium are usually identified based on their electrical conductivity, or EC. Soils with an EC greater than 4 are generally considered saline. There are 3 major constraints to plant growth on saline soils. These include the water deficit plants experience on saline soils. Salty water is actually harder for a plant to take up than non-salty water. So even though water is there, if it's salty, the plants can experience drought. The second effect of saline soils has to do with the direct toxicity of sodium. If too much sodium enters the plant, sodium directly interferes with a number of metabolic processes important for plant growth, such as protein synthesis. As a third factor, too much sodium entering the plant can alter the nutrient balance of plants by actually suppressing the uptake of essential plant nutrients. Therefore, plants in saline soils may actually have less essential nutrients available for growth. Tomorrow we will conclude our discussion of plant nutrition and talk about management options. We have spent some time talking about nutrients essential for plant growth as well as elements toxic to plant growth. So if you have listened to portions of this discussion, you are probably thinking about how you can apply this information to your particular crop to improve plant growth. Because these questions are fairly complex and are very specific to the type of plant you're growing as well as your soil chemical properties and the chemical properties of your irrigation water, we will wrap up this discussion by talking about some general principles. The good news is that there is a lot of information available out there that may help you with a particular crop and soil system. In general, getting an accurate handle on nutrient deficiencies is fairly complex. On the other hand, based on management practices in the region, it is possible to make a pretty good guess about what nutrient and chemical amendments can be applied at a reasonable cost to increase plant growth. Probably one of the biggest hurdles we face is with what is in our irrigation water. In arid land systems such as Harney County, we have alkaline soils, high evaporative demand, and hard water. This makes it extremely difficult to leach salts and other toxic elements from the soil profile once they start to accumulate, and over time this can severely limit plant growth. This concludes our discussion of plant nutrition. This is Jeremy James. Thanks for listening.